The SpongeBob period piece specials were quite memorable due to their iconic settings. But if you set aside all the fancy visuals, alternate character designs, and catchy tunes, did any of these specials function as meaningful stories? Chapter 1. Ugh. What better place to start talking about period pieces than at the very beginning of history? So I suppose a good question to ask is, should prehistory count as a period piece? And I suppose in order to answer that question, we have to define what a period piece is, which should be simple, right? It's just a story that takes place in a different time period. But I think another element to a period piece is a commentary on the social interactions of that time period. Different times had different conditions, which caused people to act differently towards each other, and a good period piece comments on that. It's for this reason that I classify Ugh as a period piece, because it does comment on the social interactions of people who lived in prehistoric times. Sure, it's kind of Flintstone-y in the sense that the world itself looks like how the world would have looked millions of years ago, whereas the much more human-coded characters are cavemen, which is more like 10,000 years ago, but that's more so just a way to make the episode look more interesting. So I am willing to suspend my disbelief and understand that the social framework of the episode is that of prehistoric hunter-gatherers. It's impossible to talk about Ugh without talking about SB-129, which we can also consider a period piece. The main difference between these two episodes is that SB-129 is a time travel episode, whereas Ugh simply takes place within its time period, with no connection to present day. In SB-129, the conflict in the prehistoric section is driven by the social differences between present-day Squidward and past SpongeBob and Patrick, which plays into the main lesson of the episode, which is to not run away from the people you belong with. This same theme is also reinforced in the section of SB-129 where Squid travels to the future. But the future, in my literary opinion, does not count as a period piece, because since the future hasn't happened yet, any story taking place in the future is much more so a commentary on present-day social norms, by showing how those norms can change, like how in SB-129 everything is chrome in the future. A joke that is funny because it criticizes advancements that turn everything the same. But period pieces comment on a specific time period's social norms, and since a past time period is one we already know exists due to social and anthropological record, the writers have to create the story within that framework. Unlike a story that takes place in the future, where the writers will have to come up with what the future may look like themselves. So onto Ugh. This was a pretty hyped up SpongeBob special back in the day, as what was before only a brief scene in SB-129 has now been elevated to not only a full episode, but an extended special. Ugh is defined by one key writing decision. The episode has minimal dialogue. The characters do talk, but it's this kinda gibberish me SpongeGar type of speaking. This writing decision could have led to a unique story presented visually, but in execution, it caused the episode to over-rely on long, drawn-out slapstick moments, like that cringy scene where SpongeGar and Patar smack themselves for like a full minute, or the incredibly slow-paced opening, or that dreadful barbershop quartet part with the repeating frames that just goes on and on. But they were kinda stuck having the characters speak this way due to the prehistoric characters talking sort of like this in SB-129. Although, are the prehistoric SpongeBob and Patrick of SB-129 even the same people as the ones in Ugh? I remember this being a pretty big topic of debate back when this image of SpongeBob was used as a meme, and people kept calling it SpongeGar, and people were like, no, that's not SpongeGar, that's the unnamed prehistoric SpongeBob from SB-129. Let me know in the comments if you think they're the same person. Beyond its flaws, Ugh does have some positive moments. Its visuals, of course, are perhaps the thing people like the most about the episode, and Ugh does tell a story about resource management and greed by showing the three characters fighting over the newly discovered fire. However, this story doesn't even really get started until well into the second half of the special, as so much of the runtime is dedicated to this eating food montage. And sure, I get the point of the montage, it's to show why the characters like having the fire, and why they fight over it it later. But it goes on for way too long and is clearly just padding because the episode decided to not have dialogue. And while I appreciate Ugg having a story and a conclusion that teaches the lesson that fighting over something will oftentimes lead to no one getting anything, there just isn't enough substance throughout the episode to make that story worth viewing. Also, at the very end, Squog gets struck by lightning, and Patar and SpongeGar roast food over his charred body. While they make Squog attack them right before the lightning strikes, so he deserves it, during the fight over the fire, the main thing that happens in the story, all three characters are equally in the wrong. So all three should have been punished equally. But the thing that saves this episode is the Patchy segments. The Patchy segments revolve around a debate between him and Potty the Parrot over whether or not the past or the future is cooler, culminating in a final song between a robot and a caveman about worlds colliding, which teaches a lesson about embracing both sorts of things. Funny how the lesson of the Patchy segments is better than the one in the actual episode. It's kinda odd how the Patchy segments talk about the difference between the far future and the distant past, despite the fact that the episode itself only focuses on the past. It's almost like this was originally going to be a full-on SB-129 sequel focusing on both, but got changed at some point, yet they kept the same Patchy segments. So what we can see with Ugg is that even with it being a classic SpongeBob episode, it still falls into the typical pitfalls of a gimmick episode. While it has good qualities, you can tell that all the episode really amounts to is, let's show familiar characters in a different time period. And if that's the case in classic SpongeBob, that doesn't give me a whole lot of hope for the rest of this list. Chapter 2: Dunces and Dragons. Next, we jump many thousands of years later, but still very much in the past. Unlike Ugg, which took place entirely from the perspective of characters who lived within the episode's time period, Dunces and Dragons follows present-day SpongeBob and Patrick who end up in medieval times, and all of the other characters are their medieval counterparts. The way that Sponge and Pat end up in medieval times is kind of whatever. They go to a Ren Fair type place and end up jousting one another and get flung into the sky where they end up in the past. It makes enough cartoon logic sense to be acceptable, but I do feel they could have done something a little better. I'd rewrite the opening scene by having Sponge and Pat in a more large Renaissance fair setting, where they keep causing trouble due to them not understanding the customs that the Ren Fair actors are portraying, which establishes their character flaws that will be challenged later when they find themselves in actual medieval times. Then they could go to like a wizard tent, and the wizard sends them back in time so they can learn what medieval times are like firsthand. I think that rewrite is much better than, I don't know, I guess they fell or something. I also question if Patrick should have been on the journey with SpongeBob, or if the episode would have benefited from SpongeBob alone being the time traveler. As the episode stands, Sponge and Pat just kind of exist as this amorphous unit going through the motions of a generic beat the evil wizard story. Whereas if it were SpongeBob only, not only would the episode now have had one more medieval version of an established character, like Come On Barbarian Patrick would have been peak, but if SpongeBob were the only time-traveling character, he would have been more freed up to have an arc of his own. Most of Dunces and Dragons amounts to what if SpongeBob character but medieval, and these characters work well with Jester Squidward, Knight Sandy, and evil wizard Plankton, but King Krabs? I don't know. I just don't really buy Krabs as a king. I know he's the main authority figure in the show, but restaurant owner Krabs is at least limited by the fact that he's just a restaurant owner. It's weird to see him ordering executions. It's clear that they just didn't have a character who could be the king, so they just kind of defaulted to Krabs, even though he would have been better used as like a tavern keep or something. And Pearl being the damsel in distress, she just doesn't fit the role. And because I'm not really buying her in that role, I'm not as interested in the stakes. There's also this whole prophecy element of the story, but the story itself just follows exactly what the prophecy says, with no unexpected subversions along the way. A prophecy, narratively, is supposed to comment on the idea of destiny or responsibility. Why is our hero chosen for this task? And can they undo the bad prophecy or bring forth the good prophecy? And when your prophecy-based story amounts to nothing more than characters do exact thing prophecy says, then you lose out on all those valuable narrative elements. The only moment that subverts the prophecy is this joke.
Actually, it says I'm supposed to kick you out of here.
And this joke is very funny because it makes light of the seriousness of the prophecy and also reminds us that SpongeBob and Patrick are two dopes embarking on the quest. But that doesn't make up for the missed potential of the rest of the prophecy. Then the trio go through the typical motions of an adventure. SpongeBob gets his special weapon, which is a jellyfish net. He fights Sandy and she switches sides to fight with them against Planktonomor. That's the evil wizard Plankton's name, by the way. And then SpongeBob fights the dragon, and the previously foreshadowed jellyfish net doesn't work, so they stop the dragon by feeding it Krabby Patties, which were also foreshadowed earlier, but in a way that you wouldn't expect it to be the thing that solves the problem. At every turn, these moments fall completely flat because the narrative did so little work to make SpongeBob and Patrick anything more than blank slates bearing witness to the events that unfold around them. Like, SpongeBob gets a jellyfish net instead of a sword. Okay, that's clever and endears us to the character, because the only weapon he can wield is one that is particularly non-violent. But what does this jellyfish net moment actually say about SpongeBob as a character? Does it properly comment on his sunny optimism as a foil to the bleak time period he now finds himself in? Does it ring home a theme of finding a non-violent solution in a time period known for violent conflict resolution? Not really. They just hand SpongeBob a jellyfish net instead of a sword because, you know, SpongeBob jellyfishes. We see him with a jellyfish net all the time. It's recognizable. And then they got to kill a few minutes of its extended runtime with the blacksmith scene. And the whole Dark Knight Sandy thing. Why is Sandy initially on Planktonomor's side? What is it about her that made her switch sides? The narrative doesn't play into Sandy being from dry land at all, even going so far as to not have her in a very believable suit. Perhaps they could have played around with Sandy's status as an outsider and how in that time period it was difficult for her to assimilate, leading to her becoming Planktonomor's Dark Knight. And when she switches sides, why? There's a little bit of a theme of mercy that since SpongeBob spared her after she lost the fight, she felt indebted to him. But similar to the jellyfish net problem, it just kind of happens rather than it being focused on as this righteous act of mercy. And then the jellyfish dragon. The whole it destroys the net but is tamed by Krabby Patties thing is just a twist for the sake of a twist, you know? It's like, ooh, we got you, didn't we? You thought it would be the jellyfish net, but it's really the burger. See? It wasn't what you thought it was. But twists like this only mean something if they, you know, mean something. Oh yeah, and then at the final celebration, the horses just fling SpongeBob and Patrick back to the present day, so them returning home had nothing to do with the rest of the story. Dunces and Dragons does stand out from both the special I just talked about, Ugh, and the special I'm about to talk about, Pest of the West, because unlike those two specials, I actually liked Dunces and Dragons as a kid. See, Dunces and Dragons has just enough funny jokes to get past its lack of story, at least to a younger audience, that is. For the most part, a SpongeBob episode with a bad story or no story is less funny. There is a correlation between a good story and good comedy. The reason for this is simple. Comedy works because it's telling a specific truth in a wacky way. If something doesn't have a story, it's not really telling you anything. So it doesn't have much room to tell you a truth. So there's not a lot of room for laughter. But sometimes a non-story is able to squeeze in enough laughs to make people look past its blatant story flaws. The episode accomplishes this in a few different ways, with the most significant being Squidly, who hard carries this episode. And what is Squidly most remembered for? Songs. A song is one way that an episode that lacks a story can have a strong resonating moment, because a song can be its own micro-story. And if you combine that with a jester character who resembles a recognizable cartoon octopus, then you've got a perfect way to get some genuine laughs in an otherwise hollow narrative. This is best illustrated with Squidly's most memed-on number, where he mocks King Krabs for allowing the dragon to destroy their city. This moment works, ironically, for the very same reason jester songs were beloved historically. They call out power. And in the minute or so of the song's runtime, that is its own self-contained story. And because of that, it resonates. And because it resonates, it's funny. Some other bits of humor that, while they don't do much story-wise, still read as funny are the simple, olden-time subversions, like the blacksmith guy thinking SpongeBob is his landlord and saying,
I told you people before, I'll have the rent when I have it!
or the part with the ye old bowling alley. Funniest joke I ever heard when I was 9.
Not the bowling alley!
But even though I concede that Dunces and Dragons is a rare example of an episode that succeeds in humor despite failing at story, I maintain that it would have been a much better and funnier episode if it did follow these basic writing principles. And I don't think our fond memories of singing along with Squidly's jester songs should keep us from acknowledging that fact. Chapter 3. Pest of the West. Pest of the West is the Old West themed SpongeBob period piece, which aired during the incredibly special-heavy Season 5. This was around the time that SpongeBob was aware of how hot of a show it was, and this awareness on the part of out-of-touch executives led to an abundance of over-advertised and underwritten specials. And in that environment, a special like Pest of the West is the perfect cynical corporate project. It's a special that gets a lot of attention with its unique setting, but when looking at the final product, it amounts to not much more than the regurgitating of a bunch of tired tropes. Pests of the West's framing is different from our previous two period pieces. Unlike Ugh, which has no connection whatsoever to the present-day characters and instead focuses entirely on the prehistoric versions of the characters, Pest of the West is framed through present-day SpongeBob learning about his Old West ancestor. And unlike Dunces and Dragons, which involved present-day SpongeBob and Patrick time traveling to medieval times with only the non-SpongeBob and Patrick characters getting medieval counterparts, the Old West portion of the story takes place entirely within that time period, with only Old West versions of the characters. Of these three kinds of ways to present a period piece, all of them could work. While I have my criticisms of these episodes, I do think all three of them represent a different and unique way to craft a period piece. Like in a vacuum, the framing device of Pest of the West could have made for a solid story about someone in the present learning something from the past, but this episode doesn't really engage with that properly. See, the reason that SpongeBob read the history book is because he finds out that Patrick and a bunch of his other friends have famous ancestors, so he wants to see if he has one too. Now, there's a lot that could be done with a story like this. You could comment on how history can sometimes get muddied over the centuries. You could have an inspiring message about how even if you yourself don't have any remarkable ancestors, you could still do something great in your own life. Or you could have a message about how being written down in the history books doesn't mean everything, and you can make a meaningful difference in the lives of others no matter who you are. The episode does none of this. It's just SpongeBob reads about SpongeBuck and finds out some statue was actually a statue of his famous ancestor after he cleaned it up. So the lesson is that if you happen to have a famous ancestor, yay! How inspiring. Okay, so the message of the framing device is bunk, but what about the majority of the episode that takes place in the Old West? That story begins with SpongeBuck first arriving in Deadeye Gulch, which is Old West Bikini Bottom. Kind of odd how they frame SpongeBuck as a newcomer who is meeting all of the other Old West versions of the characters for the first time. It's almost like they originally wrote it where SpongeBob time traveled to the Old West, but then decided to change it later, but still had him arriving into town being an element of the story. Or perhaps it's because in a lot of Westerns, the hero is someone who comes in from out of town to save the day. Is that a thing in Westerns? I don't know, I haven't seen that many. The conflict of the story doesn't amount to much more than Plankton bad, with Deadeye Plankton being like this greedy businessman who owns all of the town except the Krusty Krab saloon, which he's about to buy up. I guess that's like a flimsy stand-in for him wanting the secret formula, but it doesn't really work because there isn't anything special about this Krusty saloon that would make it something we as the audience should not want to fall into the wrong hands. Plankton also doesn't really work as a villain with this much power. Like, they sing a whole song about how evil he is, and he comes in and starts bossing everyone around, and it's just like, that's not Plankton. Plankton works as a villain because he's kind of pathetic, you know? His own restaurant is always failing, he's cartoonishly small, and on top of all that, his big villain motivation is petty theft of a burger recipe. And the times where Plankton is threatening, like in the first movie, it's interesting to see because he works up from his initial lack of power. But in Pest of the West, he starts off with all of this power that is just completely unearned. The fact that it's a kid's show doesn't do us many favors here either. Like, usually a black hat Old West villain like this would be the fastest gunslinger in the West. But, you know, standards and practices and all that. But the show doesn't really do any work to work around having Plankton not have a gun. It just acts like he's dangerous because he's the bad guy. Planktonomore in Dunces and Dragons had kind of a similar problem, starting off with too much power. But at least as an evil wizard, he was still removed from the central power of King Crabs, and they gave him the jellyfish dragon to beef up his power level. Still not perfect, both Dunces and Dragons and Pest of the West use Plankton as a pretty generic big bad, but Pest of the West definitely did it worse. Plankton being such a poorly written villain only makes how he's defeated that much lamer. So they do like the typical duel thing, but SpongeBuck accidentally steps on Deadeye Plankton, which shows everyone that he's small, so now he's, like, not powerful anymore. And it's like, wait, hold on. You're mixing up villain archetypes here. Defeating your opponent in a duel is how you deal with, an outlaw criminal type of villain. But Deadeye Plankton is a corrupt businessman kind of villain. Like, it doesn't matter if you step on him, he still owns all the land in the town. And wouldn't a rich guy like him have some, lackeys or whatever? And what is it about SpongeBuck as a character that makes him the guy to squish Deadeye? Like, there's nothing about his personality or ideology that makes him the guy to defeat this enemy. The narrative even just has him step on Deadeye accidentally, completely removing his agency when it comes to the solving of the problem. The only agency SpongeBuck does have is that he chose to do the duel in the first place, which does, to this episode's credit, teach a positive message about bravery and standing up to bullies, but when the whole hero-villain dynamic is so clunky, that message gets lost in a rotting soup of mediocrity. The final Deadeye Plankton scenes also always made me so uncomfortable. Like, all the other characters just line up to step on him over and over again. And look, I get it, he's the bad guy, so he gets punished, but my goodness, this is just a level of torture that I would not like to think about. Usually when Plankton gets squished in other episodes, it's either because Krabs is stopping him from stealing the formula, or he gets run over accidentally, usually following him doing or stating something evil. But these moments are usually brief. In comparison, this systematic, cruel, and unusual punishment is just unpleasant to watch. Even Old West Patrick is stomping away. Like, man, Patrick, I didn't know he had such a dark side. They tried to make Patrick so likable in this episode, and then at the very end, he's just stomping away like a sadist. This final punishment is made all the more worse by how incoherent of a villain Deadeye Plankton is. Like, sure, he was a corrupt businessman and he pulled Patrick's pants down or whatever, but that is far too vague for any punishment to properly work. Though, even if Plankton were better written, the stepping on scenes would probably still be too much. The episode also really suffers from not having a meaningful character arc for SpongeBuck. Him being an outsider just rolling into town really does not help with this, because he doesn't have any previously established relationships with the other characters. So the early scenes are simultaneously introducing SpongeBuck to the other characters, trying to establish him as a character, and delivering exposition, and it just becomes a big mess. I don't see why they couldn't have just had SpongeBuck already be the sheriff and have Plankton be some drifter outlaw. That still would have been an incredibly generic Western story, but at least it would have given them some wiggle room to do a little bit more with it. But the story element that feels the most forced is the idiot friend connection with Patrick. The narrative completely manufactures this friendship between these two when they've only met like once. Like, yeah, we know present day SpongeBob and Patrick are best friends, but what makes these two friends? Again, if SpongeBuck just already lived in the town, we wouldn't have any of these issues. They also keep trying to make the phrase idiot friend work. And I just don't see how that phrase works into this story. SpongeBob's arc is supposed to be about standing up for himself, whereas repeating the phrase idiot friend feels like it's reinforcing more so a theme of self-acceptance. And even if that were the case, I just don't think idiot friend is really that positive of a message, and kind of leans into a lot of how bad faith parents viewed SpongeBob back in the day as a show that glorifies stupidity. Like, I don't know, hot take or whatever, but it's actually bad to be an idiot. And I always took issue with how this episode so flippantly portrayed being an idiot as a positive thing. It just kind of muddies one of the actual most important themes of SpongeBob, which is it's okay to be yourself, and it's okay to enjoy childish things. I can tell that this idiot friend stuff is an attempt at reinforcing this theme, but also, you're calling me an idiot, man. Like, that's not very nice. And the reason this has a bad theme is quite simple. The writers did a bad job writing this episode, and because they were just trying to fill the 22 minutes with anything vaguely Old West themed enough that Nickelodeon could put it in the advertising, they ended up with some pretty clunky themes. But Pest of the West's greatest crime is just how painfully unfunny it is. I talked earlier about how UGG is propped up by its art direction and vibes, and how Dunces and Dragons is still able to remain funny despite having little story due to it containing musical numbers and well-placed period piece jokes. But Pest of the West has just about no redeeming qualities. Like, I just need to rant for a bit about how unfunny this joke is.
Give me a shot of milk.
Milk?
2%.
What? Why would you say it like that? Okay, so it's a kid show alcohol joke, right? You know, they can't say alcohol names. So SpongeBob, you know, he just asked for a shot of milk. But why does he say shot like that? It's just such a clunky and nonsensical joke that means nothing other than you thought cartoon character was gonna drink alcohol, but he drinks milk instead. And then he gets served just a regular glass of milk. Like, Nickelodeon didn't even let them show a shot-sized glass. This whole joke is just a disaster. And then it's followed up by another awful joke about SpongeBob having a tapeworm.
Look out, tapeworm, here it comes. Get ready, Tapey.
Get it? In this time period, there wasn't modern medicine, so they were quite casual about parasites. And then there's a half-baked concept of, like, coffin racing or whatever. Like, it's one of those people died a lot in the Old West sorts of jokes, but it keeps coming back throughout the whole episode. They keep riding around in coffins, and it just doesn't read. Chapter 4: Hysterical History. So we're jumping ahead now all the way to modern SpongeBob's hysterical history. While this episode is the main focus of this section, I think it's important to point out how after UGG, Dunces and Dragons, and Pest of the West, which aired in seasons 3, 4, and 5 respectively, we never got any sort of similar period piece special like them again. We had some normal 11-minute episodes like Spongeicus and Dear Vikings, which, while they took place in present day, they did lean heavily on time period-based imagery and leaned little on story. More recently, we had some fairy tale parodies and that one Moby Dick parody, but those are more so parodies than full-on period pieces. But another big special that revolves entirely around an alternate time period Bikini Bottom just never happened again. And I think one reason for this kind of special not being done much anymore is that the media landscape that motivated the creation of specials like this no longer exists. As I said earlier, these specials were defined by their marketing. They were an event, and because they were an event, they needed a thing to make them stand out, and the time period setting was a slam dunk answer. And while modern SpongeBob does still do specials, they more so rely on specials that get them attention on the internet rather than in advertising, such as the reference-heavy SpongeBob and Patrick's Timeline Twist-Up. In a way, this video feels like a period piece, a look back at a time gone by when what we were excited to watch was determined by TV ads. And while I, in a lot of ways, yearn for that time, one, because I was a kid and didn't have to pay taxes, and two, because I think we had a much healthier media landscape, I do acknowledge that this was one instance where the expectation to put out special events driven by marketing led to the creation of incredibly subpar episodes. Of course, this is also the media landscape that produced classic SpongeBob as a whole, so it was a net positive compared to the disaster that is the streaming era that motivates the creation of stuff like Kamp Koral, which, by the way, I recently reviewed every, and I mean every, episode of Kamp Koral on this channel. You should really check it out. Link in the description. description. Anyway, while modern SpongeBob doesn't really have any period piece specials like the days of old, there is one regular episode that still is kinda period piece-ish, and that is Hysterical History, which instead of focusing on one time period has multiple back-in-time segments. The framing device being that SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy are visiting a history museum and SpongeBob and Patrick keep telling these wacky recountings of history is just a cynical way for the episode to do what it actually wants to do, which is show you alternate timeline version of the characters. Here's them in prehistoric times. Short little gag happens. Now here's them in Old West times. Short little gag happens. Now Mrs. Puff is Henry Ford. Haha, SpongeBob and Patrick messed up the assembly line. Wow, so clever. And of those 3 segments, 2 of them are time periods that have already been visited in previous episodes. The prehistoric section is kind of a weird combination of SB129 and UGG because it uses the SB129 character designs, but the house designs from UGG, further muddying the question I asked earlier about how if SB129 and UGG have the same SpongeBob or not. The Old West segment is completely separated from Pest of the West. Not sure why that is. Maybe they know that Pest of the West isn't a very popular episode, so they didn't feel like referencing it. Then the episode has the audacity to literally just cycle through still images of SpongeBob and Patrick as different 20th century decade designs. The easiest way to go, here are the characters in alternate time periods, ending off with the 90s showing the original drawings of SpongeBob and Patrick. And I just cannot think of a better metaphor for modern SpongeBob than this. Them just going, remember classic SpongeBob? In the middle of an episode that has absolutely none of the substance and writing skill that made classic SpongeBob good in the first place. Then it ends with a whole thing about how Old Man Walker wants to rule the world in the future. That's not really a period piece thing, it's just one of my pet peeves when a show takes like an old person and makes them super threatening all of a sudden. Oh, you thought he was an old man, but he's actually evil. Wow, did it take you all morning to come up with that riveting twist? So, of all the period pieces we've looked at today, they all fail miserably at telling meaningful stories. Well, all but one. SB129's prehistoric section. And the reason SB129 succeeds while all these other episodes failed is quite simple. SB129, I can tell, was conceived as a story first, and the period piece elements all came later, while every other one, I can tell, was conceived as, let's put the characters in an alternate time period. And look, you can have that motivator as a writer, as long as you understand the actual story elements that are necessary in telling good stories, and using that interesting time period in order to enhance that story. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Seriously, I would highly recommend my Kamp Koral video. It's truly some of the best content I've ever produced on this channel. If you want to support me, consider becoming a channel member or supporting my Patreon. If you like what I do and want to see me do more of it, consider subscribing to my Patreon or becoming a channel member. See you next time.